There is a special kind of silence in the mountains. A silence so complete that even your own breathing sounds too loud. That was exactly what I had been looking for when I packed up the shredded remains of my life. Half a marriage certificate, a couple of half-broken dreams, and the clothes I could stuff into cardboard boxes, and moved into the cabin. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't modern. It smelled permanently of pine and faint old wood smoke, and you had to coax the water heater into behaving with more patience than a saint. But it was mine, after years of enduring the thick, choking noise of city life and the even thicker, choking drama of a marriage that died one sarcastic remark at a time. The cabin seemed like a life raft in a storm. The divorce hadn't just taken its toll emotionally. It had left me exhausted down to the marrow. The cabin, in contrast, was quiet, steady, and mercifully indifferent to whether I was lovable or not. And in the way that only raw pine and stone foundations can, it whispered that maybe I had a chance to rebuild something resembling peace. That's the thing about peace, though. It's always more fragile than you expect. You think it's a fortress, but the right knock on the door will reveal it's really more like a flimsy picket fence, and my knock came wearing a pastel cardigan and SUV shiny confidence. It was a bright spring day when I first met Karen. I was sitting on the porch, brush in hand, staining the weather-worn front steps. My hands were sticky with lacquer, my mind blissfully blank for the first time in months, when her figure appeared on the gew path like someone had dropped a whole HOA board, meeting into the middle of the woods. She walked toward me with the kind of grin that seemed practiced in front of a bathroom mirror, wide, polished, pleasant, a performance more than an expression. "Well, hello there," she chirped, her voice carrying too easily through the mountain stillness. "You must be the new owner. I'm Karen, your unofficial welcome committee." She actually rested her hand on her chest when she said welcome committee, as though it was a respectable civic title. I wiped my sticky fingers on my flannel pants, gave her a polite nod, and muttered something about being glad to be here. Her questions came fast, like bullets in a cheerful machine gun. Where did I move from? How long had I been here? How much had I paid for the place? Was I planning on fixing it up and flipping it? Staying long? I tried to answer politely, though my inner voice whispered that something was off. Curiosity was one thing. Interrogation was another. When I mentioned, a little awkwardly, that I'd bought the place after a divorce because I needed quiet, her head tilted to the side in emotion almost rehearsed. "Oh," she said with feigned sympathy. "Well, these cabins are very transitional. People hardly ever stay long. They either sell within the year or..." She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "They realize mountain life isn't for them." There it was, a tiny red flag flapping in the breeze. At the time, I brushed it off. I figured she was just another nosy neighbor, bored enough with her own life that mine looked like a more interesting play to comment on. But in hindsight, that was the moment the seeds were planted. She wasn't asking those questions for idle chatter. She was sizing me up. Or maybe she was sizing up my cabin. Karen had the air of a suburban queen bee dropped into the wrong habitat. Her SUV was so polished you could signal satellites with the glare, and she wore yoga pants that probably cost more than my truck was worth. She looked, in short, like the kind of woman who treated brunch like a competitive sport. Out here in the mountains, among mud-stained boots and flannels that had seen more winters than we wanted to count, she stood out like a sequined cocktail dress at a lumberjack contest. And yet, she carried herself like she owned the place or would soon. The second time we crossed paths, I caught her walking along the edge of my property line, tape measure in hand. Now, when you've moved out to the woods specifically to avoid drama, the last thing you expect is to find your neighbor treating your land like a DIY project on her to-do list. "What are you doing?" I called out, trying to keep my tone polite, though my stomach twisted. She laughed, that airy kind of laugh people use when they're pretending to be innocent. "Oh, this silly landscaper of mine must have misplaced one of the boundary markers. I'm just checking." Her grin was entirely too smug for the explanation. My gut told me she wasn't measuring for landscaping. She was measuring because she was already in some corner of her entitled brain, imagining where the for sale sign would look best. I let her walk away with a wave. Mistake number one. The real seeds of trouble began piling up soon after. Flyers began showing up in my mailbox. They weren't addressed to me by name, not to the rightful property owner, but instead to current occupant. The kind of letters that scream transience. as though I didn't own my land so much as I rented it from the ghost of goodwill. Karen, meanwhile, started dropping strange lines into conversation when she happened to stop by during my grocery unloading or trail maintenance work. You know, there are some lovely buyers moving up here soon. Or, not everyone is cut out for mountain life, I've noticed. They end up going back, too lonely, too much upkeep. Always said with a smile, always coated in a syrupy sweet tone that carried the acid of insult beneath it. One evening, I thought I saw fireflies outside my cabin window. I leaned closer, expecting that nostalgic speckled glow. Instead, I found Karen at the tree line, snapping photos of my cabin on her phone. When I confronted her, calling out with a half-shocked, "Excuse me?" she simply waved. "Oh, just helping a friend who's interested in this area." Helping a friend. That was explanation number 2. My blood boiled. But here's the ridiculous part. I forced a tight laugh instead of ripping into her. Because I had moved here for peace. Because I thought ignoring her theatrics would make them stop. Ignoring Karen, I later learned, was like setting down an open garbage can in raccoon country. It only makes the digging worse. By the end of that first month, I realized Karen wasn't just my overly friendly neighbor. She was an opportunist, calculating, entitled. A person who believed what she wanted was hers, whether or not reality agreed. Her first friendly wave should have sent every alarm bell clanging, but I had been too eager to believe in fresh starts. Looking back, that was the first chapter of my so-called peaceful retreat. My quiet sanctuary was already being stalked by someone who viewed it as prime steak waiting for the butcher's knife. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid. People couldn't just decide to sell property they didn't own, right? The mountains were supposed to shelter me from the madness of the world I'd left behind. But instead, they gave me Karen, and the opening act of the longest, loudest, most outrageous neighborhood feud of my life. And all of it started with a tape measure, a plastic grin, and the illusion that she was simply being neighborly. The first sign that Karen's curiosity had mutated into something bolder came, ironically, with a knock. Not from her this time, but from 2 hikers. Backpacks slung over their shoulders and politely awkward smiles fixed on their faces. "Hi there," the taller one said, holding up a glossy pamphlet like an embarrassing piece of evidence. "We saw this listing online and, we think this might be your house?" For a second, my brain just froze. Listing my house? There was no listing. I hadn't so much as whispered the words "for sale" since I moved in. But sure enough, the brochure had a photo of my cabin, my porch. My very real, very mine porch. They stood there, boots muddy, pamphlet extended between us, expecting me to explain what year the cabin was built and whether the water line was stable. All I could do was laugh. Not out of humor, the laughter was sharp, frantic, the kind that bubbles up when reality caves under absurdity. "This isn't for sale," I said, motioning toward the world around us like a deranged flight attendant. "This is my home, private, not listed. Not on the market. At all." The couple exchanged glances. Their expressions told me they believed me, but also that they'd believed the listing too. Doubt lingered between us like secondhand smoke. After they hiked away, mumbling apologies, I bolted inside and flipped open my computer. Hours of frantic clicking, caffeine chugging, and mounting dread led me exactly where I feared. There it was, my sanctuary plastered on every major real estate site like an unwanted celebrity on tabloids. Motivated seller, prime mountain getaway. Contact Karen, there she was. Her name bold as daylight in the realtor field. My jaw clenched until I thought my molars might crack. My stomach knotted as I scrolled through the photos. Not just wide shots anyone could have snapped from the road, but angles from my porch, pictures of my garden, close-up images of living room windows. Someone had been here, on my property, snooping, photographing, packaging my life like fresh meat on a grocery shelf. Some rational fragment of my brain tried to whisper explanations. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe there was a glitch in the ether of the internet. But that hope lasted about as long as an ice cube on a griddle, because the listing contact wasn't some nameless bot. It was Karen. Our neighborhood mascot of saccharine entitlement had leveled up. She was now fabricating my home into her personal side hustle project. I confronted her the next morning, storming up her driveway, heart pounding like a drumline inside my ribcage. She emerged from her door with a smile, clutching a smoothie cup like she'd just come back from yoga. "Karen, My voice was sharp, colder than the ice in her ridiculous health drink. Why is my house listed online with your name attached? Her smile never faltered. In fact, it widened, as though fake cheerfulness could drown reality. Oh, that, I was just gauging interest. She sang out as if her behavior were equivalent to asking whether I owned a plunger she could borrow. Gauging interest? My voice cracked. This is my property. You don't just list someone else's house. That's not gauging, words failed me. Illegal. She waved her hand, a casual flick as though dismissing a fly. Don't take it so seriously. There are buyers looking. I'm just connecting dots. If you aren't interested in selling, no harm done. Blood roared in my ears, but she strolled back inside humming, leaving me in her driveway, fists trembling with rage, knowing that screaming wouldn't make her hear me. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin felt sinister. My brain conjured images of strangers frog marching through my bedroom with clipboards, whispering about potential renovations. My safe place had become a stage set for idiots auditioning as property hunters, and Karen had cast herself as director. The escalation came in waves. First, a realtor I'd never met pulled into my driveway one afternoon with two men in khaki pants. They walked around casually, tape measure in hand, murmuring about square footage potential. I stormed out onto the porch. Excuse me, this is private property. Their startled faces turned upward. We have a showing, one muttered sheepishly. This isn't for sale, I snapped. That woman doesn't own this. I own this, get out! My shouting carried across the pines louder than I'd intended. The men backed away, muttering apologies, but not before jotting down something on their clipboard as though reality wasn't quite enough proof. It happened again, and again. Random couples wandering up my driveway with cheerful questions about whether I accepted FHA loans. Realtors asking if they could have a peek at the foundation. At one point, a man actually asked to see the master bedroom before making an offer. I almost choked on my fury. The absurdity grated because every warning sign, every no trespassing marker, every locked gate, every bright orange paint stripe meant nothing. Karen had rewritten reality online, and apparently everyone believed clicks and listings more than truth spilling from my own roaring voice. I began documenting. Photos of trespassers, timestamps, printouts of every fraudulent online posting, but when I contacted officials, they brushed me off with sympathy that barely masked dismissal. Online scams happen, they said. But it's my house, I argued. I live here, they shrugged. Unless someone breaks in, there isn't much we can do. Apparently, faking sales of a home you don't own wasn't a crime until the intruder was caught red-handed in your pantry. The more calls I made, the lonelier I felt. Karen's lies spread quickly, saturating every corner of the community like an unchecked invasive weed. Meanwhile, I was the crazy guy in the flannel pajamas screaming at hikers with clipboards. And the worst part? Karen knew it. One late afternoon, grilling on the porch, I spotted the telltale flicker again. Light blinking through the trees. Only this time I caught her in the act, phone raised, photographing the cabin's windows and perimeter like she was finishing a professional real estate portfolio. Karen! I barked. She glanced up with that infuriating half-smile. Oh, don't worry, just cataloging for a friend. I saw red. Cataloging? This is my... But she had already turned, waving, leaving like she'd just finished arranging peonies in a vase. It was violation layered upon violation. Not just trespassing, but desecration of space, turning my refuge into her monopoly property piece. By this point, the neighbors' whispers had started to curdle. Curious cars crawled slowly past, drivers snapping photos. Flyers appeared, stapled to trees near the road. For sale by family representative. Representative of what? Delusion? The breaking point for this chapter came with one final gut punch. A new listing surfaced online one night during my sleepless surveillance, and this time the pictures weren't just exterior shots. They were inside, my living room, my kitchen, my bedroom. Someone had crossed the threshold while I was away, snapped shots of my personal, private life, uploaded them like trophies to bait buyers. I sat at my table, fingers digging into the wood, skin crawling with the crushing truth. Karen hadn't just dabbed paint on the boundary line anymore. She had broken into my sanctuary when I stormed to her house demanding answers. My voice shaking with fury, she greeted me with mock surprise, as if she wasn't knee-deep in criminal exhibitionism. "You broke into my house," I shouted. "You took photos, posted them. You're impersonating ownership." Her smirk cut through my outrage. "Good luck proving anything." 5 words. That was her armor. Good luck proving anything. And for a while she was right. The law dithered. Evidence scattered. Doubt whispered in my neighbor's ears. Realtors continued showing up as though the gate and signs were mere decorations. Karen's campaign of illusion spread like wildfire, and I was left pacing inside my cabin with boiling fury and mounting paranoia. My once peaceful retreat had become a stage for fraud, a trespassing carnival hosted by one entitled suburban villain who deeply believed reality was optional. Yet even in my worst panic, one truth stuck like steel under skin. If I didn't fight back, this wouldn't just be a nuisance. This would end with me out on the road while she smirked from my porch, and I swore with every red no trespassing sign I hammered into the dirt that she would regret crossing into my quiet mountain life. By the time the third stranger wandered up my driveway asking if the caretaker was home, I realized Karen wasn't just playing games anymore. She was manufacturing her own reality. And the worst part? People were starting to believe her version instead of mine. It was strange living like that. On the surface, my cabin still looked the same. Just pine boards clinging together on a rocky slope, wind rattling through the eaves at night. But beneath that veneer, beneath every whisper of the trees, I could feel the rot spreading. I started walking around my own property like a trespasser, double-checking locks, peering out windows before opening doors. Because reality in Karen's hands was slippery. Online, I was the desperate homeowner in foreclosure, ready to sell fast. In person, I was just the emotional caretaker holding on to property he didn't really own. And Karen? She was the benevolent family representative, swooping in to rescue a sad story and connect eager buyers. The audacity was breathtaking. She wasn't even selling her own lie quietly. She was performing it with gusto day after day, each retelling smoother, silkier, more venom wrapped in a bow. The official world wasn't going to save me. The county clerk had shrugged when I dropped off yet another packet of screenshots showing fraudulent listings. The sheriff's office sighed through the phone. "We can't make an arrest over someone posting photos," which meant I was on my own. At first I doubled down on logic, thinking if I just showed people the deed, the tax receipts, the sheer avalanche of proof, it would end. Surely the world bent toward reason eventually, right? Wrong. Because the people Karen targeted weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a deal. And deals thrive on denial. If you dangle the idea of a motivated seller long enough, some part of the human brain wants it to be true, even if reality sits there screaming in red Sharpie across a private property sign. The gaslighting phase began slowly, like erosion. Neighbors I'd nodded to on hikes now avoided my eyes. A woman at the local store overheard my name and whispered loudly, "Oh, he's the one hoarding the family property. What a shame, hoarding my own house." Imagine that. Strangers parked on the road just outside my fence, whispering and pointing like I was some landmark attraction. The crazy guy's not-for-sale cabin. I felt like a roadside oddity, some roadside muffler man statue draped in myths. Every public interaction left me simmering, because I could feel Karen's invisible fingerprints on it. She had positioned herself as the Good Samaritan, explaining with theatrical sorrow to anyone who'd listen that she was trying to help pour me out of my financial burden, while I clung to an impossible situation. She told them I wasn't the owner, just a caretaker, that I was socially unstable, holding onto something that wasn't really his, derailing happy buyers and misrepresenting the property. Caretaker. That word slithered under my skin like a parasite. The absurdity was one thing, the invasion was another. Realtors still appeared at my gate. At least 3 times that month I found tire tracks gridded into my driveway, evidence of cars that had pulled up and scouted around while I was away. Even worse were the tourists. That's what I came to call them, the gawkers who'd roll up armed with curiosity and smartphones, murmuring about the foreclosure listing or the fixer-upper. At one point, 2 teenagers balanced on the fence like vultures, filming a TikTok they cheerfully called Karen's Crazy Cabin Drama. Yes, the saga was trending before it was even resolved. One particularly humid afternoon, I discovered the darkest twist in Karen's storytelling campaign. A flyer stapled to a wooden post by the road proclaimed in block letters, "Foreclosure pending, motivated seller. Viewing available, contact representative. Karen, phone number." My jaw tried to hit the gravel. She had escalated from gauging interest to inventing my financial ruin. When I tore it down handshaking, I felt a new kind of fury cracking through the exhaustion. I hadn't just been made the villain of her fantasy sales pitch. She was smearing my name to anyone passing by, painting me as a bankrupt squatter too embarrassed to admit reality. That was the genius of Karen's gaslighting. She didn't just list my home. She rewrote the narrative. If I yelled, it was evidence of instability. If I locked my gate, it was evidence I had something to hide. If strangers showed up, it was further proof of her story that I couldn't handle interest in the property. She won either way. Logic screamed I should ignore her. But ignoring her was like ignoring termites. You don't see the damage right away, but by the time you look again, the beams are hollow. The paranoia grew sharper by the day. I stapled new red signs to the trees. Private property. Not for sale. Trespassers will be prosecuted. But each time I hammered in a warning, it felt more like painting lipstick on a bomb. Karen was too shameless and too practiced. She smiled in pastel sweaters and SUVs with motivational bumper stickers. Monsters in the city at least looked the part. Out here they wore yoga pants and hummed cheerfully after breaking into your house. The climax of this chapter, the moment I realized how badly gaslighting can bleed into perception, came on a hot afternoon when yet another realtor appeared, towing 2 would-be buyers. I stormed out, brandishing my deed like a desperate magician. "This is my property," I barked. "This is not for sale." The realtor frowned, flipping through her clipboard. "But Karen said you were the caretaker." The buyers shuffled awkwardly, muttering that the listing had promised an urgent sale. And when I shouted again, louder, more furious, the expression on their faces shifted. They weren't looking at Karen like the lunatic. They were looking at me. Disheveled man in flannel pajamas, yelling in the middle of the woods, veins standing out in his fists. That's when it hit me. Karen's real power wasn't trespassing. It was narrative. She had manipulated the optics so completely that even I looked like the intruder in my own story. The fear that crawled through my veins that evening wasn't just about losing the cabin. It was about losing reality itself. To keep myself sane, I started documenting everything with military discipline. Photos, timestamp notes, even audio recordings of passerby calling my place Karen's listing. I bought motion-activated trail cams and hid them high in the branches, their blinking red eyes capturing every SUV that pulled up uninvited. These weren't just defensive tools anymore. They were lifelines. Because I knew if Karen managed to convince enough people of her version, my voice alone would never compete. Truth needed receipts. And I was gathering an arsenal. Each ding of my phone alert when someone tripped the motion camera felt like static electricity under my skin. Sometimes it was a wandering deer or raccoon. Sometimes it was a stranger, clipboards in hand, checking potential renovations. And always, always in the background of my mind was the possibility that one night it wouldn't just be a passerby with curiosity, it would be Karen again. Or worse, Karen bringing a buyer bold enough to push past the gate. Through it all, she strolled down the road like a peacock, smooth and smug, humming as she spread her poison. Neighbors whispered. Realtors sniffed around. Cars trickled in as though her campaign had turned my home into a cursed carnival attraction. The sheer absurdity was laughable, but the consequences were terrifying. My safe sanctuary was being transformed, patched brick by patched brick, into a stage where I was forced to play the madman while Karen played realtor queen. And I knew, in my bones, she wouldn't stop until she forced a breaking point. Gaslighting works that way. It bends and bends until eventually it snaps. And when it did, it would either destroy her story forever, or destroy me. By the time Karen rolled back up my driveway with yet another realtor in tow, I was no longer shocked. Shock had burned itself out weeks ago, leaving only raw nerves and the simmering energy of a man too tired to cower and too angry to wait. That morning, I'd stared at my locked gate like a duelist fingering his pistol. Every motion sensor, every extra chain, every freshly painted sign was part of a field I had turned into a fortress. No more frantic yelling from my porch. No more desperate attempts to wave down sheriffs and convince them of the story. This wasn't defense anymore, this was strategy. Something in me had snapped when I realized she was never going to stop. Not after being caught photographing my house. Not after the online listings. Not after trespassing buyers wandering through my driveway like tourists touring a museum. She wasn't running out of gas. She was doubling down again and again, spinning fiction into truth until she half believed it herself. So the next time she came, I told myself, she wouldn't leave smiling. The showdown unfolded on a hazy afternoon when the pine-scented air hung thick as smoke. I noticed her SUV edging the curve of the road, creeping slowly, rehearsing its entrance like an actor waiting for curtain call. Behind her trailed another car, sleek black, glossy, and behind that, a couple in matching fleece vests clutched clipboards and brochures. There it was, another showing, another invasion. But this time, I was ready. I had left the gate crack just wide enough for her SUV, baited like a trap. I'd parked my truck out of sight. Cameras blinked from every angle, streaming live. And because I had grown cunning, I'd also invited 2 friends from town who'd witnessed her antics before. They sat quietly on my porch, sipping coffee, casual as stagehands waiting for the cue. Let the play begin. Karen made her entrance like a queen presenting her castle. She rolled the SUV halfway up the drive, popped out in oversized sunglasses, and gestured grandly toward my cabin as if she were blessing a lucky audience. Her voice naturally carried, and here we are, the most desirable listing in the valley. The realtor trailed beside her, polite smile strained while the couple shuffled eagerly behind, already murmuring about renovation potential. I waited. Let them all cross the threshold. Let them all believe the gate had opened to another illusion. And then, calm as clockwork, I stepped out from behind the shed. Karen froze mid-sentence as I swung the gate shut with deliberate weight. Metal clanged against metal. My hand slid the chain through, the padlock dropping into place with a click loud enough to echo through the pines. Every head turned at once. "What?" the male buyer whispered, pointing at the locked gate. The realtor actually paled. "What is this?" Karen, of course, did what Karen always did. She laughed too brightly. "Oh, he's just dramatic. He does this sometimes." But her voice wavered just barely, and I stepped forward, phone recording, voice steady. "This is my land," I declared, louder now, so the road beyond us could hear. "Private property. Not for sale. And you," I pointed at Karen, "are trespassing with fake buyers, again." The realtor shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between me, the cameras, and Karen. The couple glanced over their shoulders at the locked gate, realizing they were fenced in with a man who looked far too calm for someone holding a phone and a folder bristling with papers. The seed of doubt blossomed in their expressions. "I have every right," Karen began, but her voice cracked under the weight of the moment. Her outstretched hand trembled, and that crack was more satisfying than any victory I'd imagined. I lifted the folder I kept tucked at my side, flipping pages like a dealer fanning out cards in the middle of a poker game. Deed, tax receipts, court letters, every scrap of evidence proving ownership. "Proof?" I barked. "Here's proof. What you have," I jabbed the air at Karen, "is a stack of lies and a big enough ego to choke on." For once I didn't lose my temper, didn't scream wildly the way she wanted me to. Instead, my voice hardened, deliberate, recorded by multiple phones. Calm fury is far more dangerous than panic, and Karen knew it. Behind the property line, traffic slowed. Hikers stopped mid-trail, whispers spreading. Karen's at it again. A couple of my neighbors who had once rolled their eyes at my paranoia now stood roadside, curious. And then, the most beautiful thing happened. Phones rose like a sea of blinking eyes, recording everything. Karen had always thrived on spectacle. Well, so could I. The realtor backed away from her, stammering about miscommunication. The buyers wilted, panic fluttering in their faces, the oxygen of plausible deniability vanishing in the mountain air. Karen, though, couldn't back down. She spun, finger jabbing at me, her voice climbing hysterically. "He's crazy. He's unstable. He's a squatter here to scare people off." And that's when I knew I had won. Because it didn't matter what words she screamed anymore. Not when 20 cameras were rolling. The facade had shattered. For the first time I saw something new flicker behind Karen's eyes. Real fear. Minutes dragged like hours until finally, flashing red lights climbed up the road. The sheriff's cruiser pulled into view, crunching gravel, headlights slicing the awkward knot of trapped people. Karen, desperate, rushed toward the gate with the shriek of a woman drowning. "Officer! Officer, thank God you're here. He locked us in. He's unstable." The sheriff stepped out slowly, scanning the chaos with the weary sigh of a man who had been expecting exactly this call. My friends immediately approached him, offering their phones like offerings to a deity. Recordings played. Karen screamed. I stood tall, folder in one hand, phone in the other, my expression quiet but resolute. The tide finally turned. The sheriff's patience snapped about 10 minutes into Karen's rant. "Ma'am, you're trespassing. You've been warned. Hand me your ID." The buyers nearly sprinted for the gate once it lifted, muttering furious apologies. The realtor vanished like smoke. "And Karen?" She stammered excuses, sputtered threats, but the steel in the sheriff's tone was final. She would not walk away untouched this time. For weeks, Karen had groomed the narrative. Me as the eccentric caretaker, her as the kind neighbor. That narrative died in broad daylight, strangled by the red recording lights of every smartphone in sight. Neighbors who once avoided me now whispered apologies. Strangers online started posting the videos with captions like, "Entitled neighbor pretends cabin is hers." Karen's precious image, the syrup-sweet suburban queen, crumbled into a caricature, a local cautionary tale. The battle of optics was over, and yet, as the sheriff finally marched her back to her SUV with a stern warning that, "Next time it's cuffs," she glanced toward me, her lips curled into a glare so venomous it could etch steel. She wasn't finished. Not yet. That night, adrenaline still shaking through my bloodstream like aftershocks, I sat on the porch with my friends, replaying the confrontation in my mind. We laughed nervously about her meltdown. We laughed because humor was safer than admitting how close it had come to something darker. But beneath the laughter, a truth pulsed steady and cold. Karen had lost this round, but humiliation wasn't defeat. People like her didn't stop when reality smacked them in the face. They doubled down, and sure enough, within days, the storm changed shape. A new listing appeared online. My cabin framed by her lies again, this time billed as bank auction imminent. My brief taste of victory soured instantly, because the SUV standoffs, the screaming echoing through pine trees, the laughter of hikers recording my rage, this hadn't been the final act. This had only been the dress rehearsal for round 2. And somewhere out there, humming to herself in her SUV polished bright enough to blind the stars, Karen was already rewriting her next script. The days after Karen's SUV was trapped inside my gate felt like those eerie moments after a storm, when the air is too clear, too bright, and you know another front is brewing just out of sight. For the first time in months, I had evidence, screenshots, videos, witnesses. The sheriff himself had written her up, stern enough to crack through her pastel armor. But experience had taught me a cruel truth. Humiliation doesn't stop people like Karen. It fuels them. My gate was still reinforced with its ridiculous array of chains and locks. But my heart never left fight mode. Sleep came in fragments. I drank coffee as though the caffeine could stand guard where the law couldn't. And I told myself over and over, this isn't over. My premonition arrived in the form of phone calls. 2 different friends from town rang me up within an hour of each other, both tight-voiced, both saying some version of, "Hey, your cabin's back online. Listing says foreclosure. Immediate cash sale. Auction scheduled. Foreclosure." The words slammed into me like a punch from the inside out. It was one thing to list my house as motivated seller, another to post trespassed photos. But now she was climbing into the intestines of bureaucracy, weaving lies into legal disaster territory. I stormed to the county clerk's office, sweat sticking my shirt to my back. The clerk, an older man who had started recognizing me as the cabin guy, pulled up the file with sympathetic eyes. There it was, my property address tagged with a fraudulent notice of default. It hadn't been processed yet, but it sat there poised to trigger a cascade of legal headaches that might bury me alive in paperwork before I even dug myself out of Karen's conquest plots. "Not official," the clerk said quickly when he saw the blood drain from my face, "but close. If you hadn't caught this now. He trailed off, shaking his head. I staggered out with copies tucked under my arm, the papers like burning coals against my chest. Proof of attempted fraud. Proof she was willing to escalate beyond social sabotage, beyond harassment. She was trying to erase the very foundation under my feet with bureaucratic sleight of hand. Why? That question gnawed at me on the drive home, and the answer came, oddly, not from a lawyer, but from a local old-timer at the diner later that night. Hearing my exhausted rant to the waitress, he leaned over and muttered, "You know, there used to be rumors about mineral rights under your property. Some kind of forgotten claim. Never panned out, but speculators sniffed around before." The final puzzle piece clicked. Karen didn't just want my house. She wanted what might lie beneath the soil. Maybe a rumor, maybe just a fantasy. But she believed, and belief paired with obsession is more dangerous than any lawsuit. By then, the community had started to shift. People who once whispered about the crazy guy in the cabin were now side-eyeing Karen in the grocery store. Flyers I handed out, with copies of the deed, timestamps, proof of her scam, circulated faster than her lies. The internet piled on too, turning her into a meme. Local woman lists stranger's cabin without asking. But she wasn't done. Because power isn't about truth. It's about persistence. And she was persistent enough to fill an entire season of reality TV. What came next was her most audacious move yet. It was a quiet golden morning when I heard the first crunch of gravel. Coffee in hand, I froze on my porch as the sight unfolded like a parade of absurdity. First, Karen's shiny SUV, polished, ostentatious, practically beaming under the sun like it was on stage. Behind her, a white luxury sedan, then another, then a third. 5 cars total eased into my driveway, lining up in a little corporate convoy. Out stepped not just another realtor, but 2, then a man in a gray suit carrying a serious briefcase, then 4 other people, shoes clicking on gravel, dressed in sleek business attire better suited to urban boardrooms than mountain dirt roads. Investors. Karen had gone big. Her final play wasn't gossip. It wasn't casual trespass. It was a full-blown investor party. Her desperate gambit to close on an imaginary sale with enough people present to bulldoze me out of my own story. There was something almost impressive about it. Almost. This time, though, I wasn't the scrambling victim. Because I had prepared, I tallied witnesses. Friends camped nearby, phones ready, my lawyer on speed dial. Motion cameras positioned to capture everything. A folder thicker than a novel tucked under my arm, loaded with every receipt, photo, affidavit, timestamp, and most importantly, the gate left open just enough to let the circus march in. They did. Karen led, smile lacquered on, voice syrup sweet as she gestured toward the cabin. And here we are. Gorgeous, isn't it? Just waiting for the right buyer. The investors trailed behind, glancing around with cautious interest, scribbling notes. The realtors strut a little, eager for commissions promised on smoke and mirrors. I waited, calmly sipping coffee, phone already recording, until every last one of them had crossed the line. Then, with deliberate, theatrical finality, I walked down the path, swung the gate closed, and snapped the chain shut. The clang echoed like a shotgun blast, eyes widened. The man with the briefcase frowned. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. Someone muttered, "Why is it locked?" And Karen did what she always did. She laughed too loudly, smiled too bright. "Oh, he does this. Dramatic caretaker. He thinks locking the gate makes him important." But there was a faint crack in her voice. I lifted my folder, held it high like a preacher's Bible, and in a voice that carried steady across the crowd declared, "This is my land, my home, my documented legal property, and every one of you is trespassing." Phones went up, blinking red lights, recordings from every angle. The investors frowned harder now, turning to Karen for answers. She opened her mouth, floundered. For the first time, she couldn't inject enough sugar. "Caretaker," she snapped, pointing at me desperately, but the word landed limp. My folder, my calm tone, the cameras, it all outweighed her tired script. "Here's the deed," I said, flipping it open and reading names, tax records, dates. "Here's the county notice confirming fraudulent filings. Here are the timestamps of your fake listings. Every single lie you've told, I have proof. And then, the moment I'll remember until I die." One of the investors asked, flat voice, "Ma'am, are you the owner of this property?" Karen blinked, stuttered, couldn't form the word yes. It was over. The sheriff's sirens wailed up the mountain not 10 minutes later, louder than I'd ever heard. While we waited, Karen spiraled, screaming about defamation, squatting, sabotage. She hissed that I didn't deserve the property, that she'd been promised it. The raw entitlement in her tone made some of the investors actually step back, disgust etched on their faces. By the time the deputies stepped onto the dirt, the show was already over. They didn't even have to take sides, the crowd did it for them. Witnesses lined up. Phones played the recordings. I handed over the flash drive with months of evidence. My lawyer arrived, slapping down the restraining order like a mic drop, and Karen, for once, no humming, no smirking. Just her hands shaking as cold metal cuffed her wrists, and she was marched toward her shining SUV, now hooked up to a tow truck for impound. The final act, fittingly, was her own humiliation, broadcast to the very audience she had courted for so long. The aftermath felt unreal. Suddenly I wasn't crazy cabin guy anymore. I was the victim who had fought back. Friends, even strangers, congratulated me. Neighbors apologized for believing Karen's spin. Hikers asked to take selfies with the famous gate. Yes, my life had become folklore. And yet, when quiet finally returned, it wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, denser, not fragile anymore. The cabin felt like an ally in the war, weathered and scarred, but stronger for it. Karen's role had ended not with victory, but with collapse, her web snapping under the weight of her own lies. And me. I finally got what I had wanted all along. Silence. Coffee on the porch. The Pines is my audience instead of investors or gawkers. The sign at my gate is still bolted there. Letters bold and sharp, private property not for sale. And if anyone asks, I just smile and say this cabin was never on the market. Not then, not now, not ever.